Join me tonight on YouTube at 6:45 p.m. Eastern, where we're going to live stream the action in the preseason between the Houston Texans and the New England Patriots. And now, on with our feature presentation. I think it's fair to say that the quarterback position is the most important position in all of football. With very few exceptions, you cannot win consistently unless you have someone good under center, and unless you can trust your signal caller. Even back in the 1960s, when there was a heavier emphasis on the running game, you still needed to have a good quarterback under center if you were going to win. All 4 Super Bowls in the 60s were won by quarterbacks that would eventually make the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Bart Starr, Joe Namath, and Len Dawson. Heck, every single NFL championship was won by a team that had a quarterback. Aside from the 5 that Bart Starr won, Norm Van Brocklin in 1960 with the Eagles was named the first-team All-Pro. Billy Wade in 1963 with the Bears made the Pro Bowl that season. Frank Bryant in 1964 with the Browns was a Pro Bowler who led the league in touchdown passes. Earl Morrall in 1968 with the Colts, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, was the MVP of the entire league. And Joe Kapp in 1969 with the Vikings, who you can also learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, was a Pro Bowler who finished second in the league that season in the MVP voting. Long story short, you needed a quarterback to win back in the 1960s, just like you do today. Which is what takes us to the team that you've been watching this whole time in the Pittsburgh Steelers. Because what happens if you have no quarterbacks on your team? And I don't mean that you have a poor depth chart at the position, or that your options at the position are terrible. I legitimately mean that it's like that one game that the Denver Broncos had in 2020 against the New Orleans Saints, where they had to start Philip Lindsay under center and eventually play wide receiver Kendall Hinton at the position because they truly had no quarterback. If you have, quite literally, no one who can play under center, how the heck is that going to go? Well, during a 1966 game against the St. Louis Cardinals, the Pittsburgh Steelers had that exact thing happen. And let's just say that, man, the Chuck Noll dynasty in the 70s with years of great quarterback play under Terry Bradshaw could not come soon enough. Because this went about as well as you would expect. Which is to say, not well. Not well at all. Because more than 60 years later, this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, the worst and the ugliest quarterback controversy in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers franchise. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of the game, as well as what the original game plan for the Steelers was. Because it's not as though they intentionally went into this game with no quarterbacks on their roster. They were incompetent, don't get me wrong, but they weren't that incompetent. It's November 27th, 1966, and as we're hitting the end of the season, we've got a big game on our hands at Busch Stadium over in St. Louis, between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the St. Louis Cardinals. The bad news was that this was only a big game for the Cardinals, who were 7-2-1 and half a game back of the Dallas Cowboys for first place in the East, at a time when only the winner of the East made it to the playoffs, as there were no wild cards. So to say that this was a must-win for the Cardinals if they wanted to win the East, make it to the NFL Championship, and have a shot at playing for football supremacy in the first ever Super Bowl, especially since they already lost to the Steelers once, would be putting it lightly. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, though, yeah, this game meant absolutely nothing. They were 3-6-1, and barring a couple of meteor strikes hitting the Midwest, they were mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. The first season under head coach Bill Austin was shaping up to be a rough one, as they entered this game having lost 6 of their last 8 games. Even if they won their final 4 games and got to 7-6-1, they would still have no shot at the playoffs, as they were 5 back of the Cowboys with 4 to play. Another year without a playoff appearance for the Steelers, in a streak approaching 2 decades at this point. And part of why that was the case was an awful offense that, as you can tell from these lowlights, had absolutely atrocious quarterback play. Through their first 10 games, the Steelers had just 186 points, which was the 4th worst total in the league out of 15 teams, and came out to just 18.6 points per game. A big reason for that was because they were banking on having Bill Nelson in a quarterback for the entire season. I talked about Nelson in a previous video of mine, so if you want to learn more about him, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And to be fair, Nelson played very well in 1966. The Steelers only lost one of the 5 starts that he made, and in his final 2 games of the season, when he started, the Steelers not only went 2-0, but defeated the Giants 47-28 and the Falcons 57-33, scoring 104 points over the 2 games and single-handedly saving their point total on the season to being a respectable number. To learn more about that Giants demolition, click the card in the upper right corner. However, the problem was that Bill Nelson was made of glass. For his entire career, he dealt with injury problem after injury problem, and the 1966 season was no exception, as during the team's second game against the Lions, Roger Brown destroyed his leg, requiring knee surgery and forcing him to miss the entire middle of the season. And starting in his place was the man that you've been watching this whole time, Ron Smith. Entering this game against the Cardinals, after they waived George Izzo a few weeks prior, the Steelers had just 2 healthy quarterbacks on their roster. One of them was Ron Meyer, a rookie quarterback that they just called up from the taxi squad, and a 22-year-old who was a 7th-round pick that wasn't even drafted by the Steelers, as he was drafted by the Chicago Bears. And the other one was Ron Smith, a man who had been in the NFL since 1964, but hadn't thrown a pass in a regular season game since 1966, which was his first season with the Steelers after spending the 1965 season with the Los Angeles Rams. Let's just say that if you were banking on Ron Smith to be your starting quarterback, you were in serious trouble, because oh brother, this guy stunk. To give you an idea of how bad he was, he started 7 games, and he finished the season completing just 43.6% of his passes. In the NFL in 1966, there were 15 quarterbacks to start at least 7 games, or half the season, which makes sense, seeing as there were 15 teams in the NFL. Here's a look at all 15 of those quarterbacks ranked by completion percentage. And sure enough, right at the bottom at 43.6%, you had Ron Smith, with the only quarterback even remotely close to him at 43.7% being rookie quarterback Randy Johnson of the Atlanta Falcons. He was not even the slightest bit accurate, as evidenced by the fact that in 9 games played, he only completed more than 50% of his passes in 2 of them. But Smith made up for his inaccuracy by being quite possibly the worst quarterback in NFL history when it came to pocket awareness. And I do not say that lightly. He made David Carr in 2002 with the Houston Texans look like late 80s Dan Marino when it came to getting rid of the ball quickly. Because I don't think I have ever seen a quarterback this bad at taking sacks. In 1966, Ron Smith got sacked 42 times, getting sacked on 18.8% of his dropbacks. 1 out of every 5 times that the Steelers attempted a pass with Smith under center, it was going to result in a sack, as he got sacked at least once in every single game, and way more than that in a lot of them. The only quarterback to get sacked more in 1966 was Los Angeles Rams quarterback Roman Gabriel. He got sacked 48 times. However, Gabriel threw 397 passes, whereas Smith threw 181, or not even half of what Gabriel did. If you want to compare Smith to the rest of the league in terms of sack percentage, there were 14 quarterbacks that qualify for this statistic, having thrown enough passes to generate a large enough sample size to the point where this stat means something. These are the first 13, with Gabriel leading the NFL at 10.8%. Again, the higher the number, the worse off you are. Now, let's throw Ron Smith into the mix. It's like he's playing his own sport, although this sport isn't really fun. Instead, it's a sport of how much punishment you can possibly take before your body breaks down. The gap between him and the next worst quarterback is significantly larger than the gap between the second worst quarterback and the best quarterback. That's how bad it was. To put this number into these terms, David Carr set the NFL record by getting sacked 76 times in 2002 with the Houston Texans. He did this on 14.6% of his passes. If he had the sack percentage that Ron Smith did, he would have been sacked 98 times. That's how bad it was. This is all to say that Ron Smith was not a good quarterback. In fact, he was, quite possibly, the worst starting option for any NFL team. And remember, Smith did all of this while healthy. So now, imagine what happens if Smith, the night before the game against the Cardinals, I don't know, comes down with the flu, is all jittery, and is feeling like absolute crap. It's only going to get worse. It's like in soccer. If you already had the worst goalkeeper in the league, and now you've still got to play him even after he broke his arm, you know it's not going to end well. Which raises the obvious question. If Smith had the flu, why the heck did they play him? Why would you play a quarterback, and a bad quarterback at that has the flu and is feeling visibly ill? Yes, there are some players that play incredibly well with the flu and overcome the obstacles somehow. Bob Greasy famously did this, oddly enough, in a 1971 game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, in a performance that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. You obviously have the Michael Jordan flugy. And I've talked plenty of times on this channel about players and quarterbacks who were sick and somehow overcame the odds to play well. Well, head coach Bill Austin didn't want to play Smith. He wasn't a good head coach by any means, but he knew better than to play a quarterback who was already terrible and was now dealing with the flu. When you're already the most sacked quarterback in the league from a percentage standpoint, and in your last game, which was a 20-7 loss to the Dallas Cowboys, you got sacked 10 times, and you're playing a team in the Cardinals that the last time you played them, you got sacked 5 times. Going out there with the flu and taking that guaranteed beating would be incredibly dangerous and irresponsible. The problem was that the backup quarterback, Ron Meyer, as in the other Ron, was also hurt. Seriously, even though Meyer tried going in against the Cardinals, which you're watching right now, he bruised both of his thighs, couldn't move, and couldn't go. So an already inept Steelers offense with no good healthy quarterbacks now had to decide who to play for the majority of this game against the Cardinals. Option 1 was Ron Smith, who's got a flu and is already terrible. And option 2 was to play Ron Meyer, who was also terrible and was badly injured. The Steelers, quite literally, had no healthy quarterbacks on their roster. On Saturday, the day before the game, this was a complete non-issue. Not even 24 hours later, their already dire quarterback situation got even more dire, as their best option was quite literally the least accurate, most sacked quarterback in football who was now dealing with the flu. I mean, does it get any worse than that? Joe Montana's Steve Young, this quarterback controversy was not. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and then there's whatever the heck this is. Which raises the question. If your two options were a man with no thighs after he took a beating by getting sacked twice, and going 1 for 5 with -6 yards, an interception, -18 net passing yards, and a passer rating of 0.0, and Ron Smith, who was, well, everything I said before, how the heck would this game go against one of the best teams in football? As you can probably guess, it went horribly, horribly wrong. As if you were a Steeler fan and actually watched all 60 minutes of this game, my condolences. You earned your half-century of success afterwards. Turns out, playing a quarterback out of necessity who has the flu and already stinks is not going to work out, and your offense is going to stall pretty badly. I know, shocker. Because even though the Steelers' defense played their hearts out, holding the Cardinals to just 6 points, and holding the Cardinals to just 4 for 17 through the air, with the team completing just 23.5% of its passes, amazingly, it was not enough, as the Steelers lost this game by only putting up 3 points. A 6-3 defeat. That's just brutal. And unsurprisingly, this man, Ron Smith, was awful. He was always awful, but he was doubly awful when dealing with the flu, as during this game, he went just 8 for 19, completing just 42% of his passes for 109 yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception, and a passer rating of 39.1, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. But hang on, because it gets worse. Because Smith got sacked a whopping 7 times, losing 54 yards on those sacks, meaning that with him in the game, not only was he sacked on 27% of his passing attempts, but the team had 55 net passing yards. As a team, the Steelers were only able to pick up 8 first downs and 78 total yards, which isn't surprising, seeing as the Cardinals dared Smith to throw with his flu and all. They stacked the box, holding the Steelers to just 32 yards rushing on 20 carries, or an abysmal 1.6 yards per carry, and essentially said, "We know you've got the flu. We know you're sick. We know you feel miserable right now, and you've got no strength whatsoever. Try and beat us with your arm and your body." And the strategy very clearly worked, as after the game, with Smith in earshot of his head coach, Bill Austin said to the press, throwing his quarterback under the bus, "Out there today, both defenses played well, but neither team had a quarterback. We had no offense. Smith had the flu or something." That just sums up the 1966 Steelers in a nutshell. I should note that the 1966 season was the last time that Ron Smith ever played a game in the NFL. In fact, this game against the Cardinals was not just the last time he ever started in the NFL, as Bill Nelson came back the following week, but it was the last time he ever played a game in the NFL, or any level of pro football for that matter. AFL, CFL, you name it. What a way to go out. Deathly ill, taking a beating, and only playing out of necessity despite having the flu because the other guy was severely injured. Ron Smith's Wikipedia page is only 3 sentences long, so this truly might be his lasting legacy, being a part of the most pathetic and the worst quarterback controversy in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers, which came during this game right here against the St. Louis Cardinals. There's an old saying that if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have no quarterback, which raises the question, what happens if you have no quarterback? What happens if your starter is already terrible and is dealing with the flu, and your backup is a rookie who got injured and can't play? Well, what happens is that you're going to stink. Like, really, really stink. Because no matter how bad the Steelers' quarterback situation might ever get in the future, whether it's this year, next year, 20 years, or 200 years down the road, I promise you, it will never get as bad as this, where they had to choose between a bad flu-ridden quarterback who couldn't go and a bad injured quarterback in the thighs who also couldn't go. Truly the definition of being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.